I've been fighting a battle within myself since I was a young boy. And this battle is with a feeling, and that feeling is the feeling of insignificance. And I'm wondering if any of you are like me in fighting this battle throughout your life with feeling like you're insignificant. This has had a large impact on my life in many ways, and the things that I think I'm capable of doing, who I think I am. It's also had a large impact on my faith and the things that I think I'm capable of through God. And I think it's a common desire we all have and a longing we have within us to feel like we matter, like we're important, and like we're significant. All of us have this longing in us, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this struggle in my life. And one of the times in my life this became most prominent for me. When I was young, I battled with this, but this became more significant to me when I moved away from home when I was 18 years old. I moved across the country from Dauphin, Manitoba, to Salmon Arm, British Columbia. And I think most of us, like me, we had parents who, at least in some ways, hopefully made us feel like we're important and we're significant. I certainly did. But when I moved away from home, I quickly realized I wasn't as important as I thought I was. My rent had to be paid, my bills had to be paid, and responsibilities had to be fulfilled. There was a lot less grace out in the world than I had experienced under my parents' roof. There were real life, unsheltered consequences for my actions. So within my first year of moving away from home, I had 4 different apartments that where I was trying to find somewhere I could afford. I moved from place to place. I worked for a mechanic. I worked for a tire shop. I delivered pizza, I washed dishes, I worked for a roofing company. There's nothing like putting 60-pound bundles of shingles on your shoulder and walking up a ladder 100 times to humble you and make you feel like you're not as important as you thought you were when you were young. But after all of this, within a year, despite all of my efforts I was making to make myself significant and important, because of some terrible decisions I'd made, I ended up with no place to live, and I was unable to secure a job. After months living on the floor of friends' homes, I ended up alone, sleeping outside in a little cove out of the wind behind a gas station. And at that point in my life, any glimpse of significance I once had was gone. Does this feeling of insignificance resonate at all with you? Do you battle this within you? It's Easter morning. I assume we're all here this morning to fix our eyes and our hearts on Jesus and his resurrection. And so for some of you, it may have been a long time since you've attended a church service. For some of you, you're here every week. And for others, this might be the first time you've taken a step to come in to a church before. If that's you this morning, I commend you for your courage, and I welcome you, and I'm glad you're here. But regardless of where you're coming from this morning, I want to ask you to think about this. When you think of Jesus, what is it that first comes to your mind? Maybe we think of the things he did. It's Easter weekend, it's Easter morning, so maybe we think of him rising from the dead. Maybe we think of Jesus on the cross. Maybe we think of Jesus walking on water, calming the storm, casting out demons. There's a lot of amazing things Jesus did that might come to our mind when we think of him. You might think of the things that he said. Jesus had a lot of significant and incredible teachings that even people who don't claim to follow Jesus still recognize as amazing teaching. He told incredible stories. He had bold proclamations. We might think more deeply than that to the identity of Christ as the Messiah. He's the Word of God. He's the light of the world. He's the hope of nations. Maybe you're new to who Jesus is, and you're not sure what you think of him at all, so maybe nothing came to mind because you weren't sure. But either way, I wonder how many of us, when we think of who Jesus is, how many of us think of the insignificance of Jesus? Did that thought pop into your mind that Jesus was insignificant? It's not usually a word that's used to describe Jesus, and in today's context, it definitely does not describe Jesus. Don't hear this morning me saying Jesus is insignificant. If we look back through history and everything that's happened throughout history, Jesus is not insignificant, and it doesn't describe him. He's become the most significant person in history. But I want to ask you to use your imagination this morning to place yourself in first century Israel. Are you guys there? It's the first century. The Roman Empire, with all of its might, has overcome and overtaken your people and your nation. And so you're an occupied nation. You're paying your taxes to Rome, and you're succumbed to the rule and the authority of Rome. So within this context, Jesus is born in a manger. He's born in a small town, and he grew up in a carpenter's family. In other words, there's nothing about Jesus' life from the outside that gave him any significance within the society and culture he grew up in. So not only was he not Roman, but even within his own Jewish community, he didn't have significance. And if that weren't enough, this weekend we think back to the time where this man of seeming insignificance in the first century within the Jewish community and the Roman Empire has been crucified, and he's been killed, and he now lays dead in a tomb. So insignificant isn't exactly the first picture that comes to most people's minds when they think of Jesus, but this is where Jesus was at the time. As we read the story of Jesus, there were very few people around him that understood who he was and viewed him as significant. Even his own disciples struggled to understand who he was when he was with them. And then after he rose from the dead, his own disciples struggled to understand what was going on. They didn't even believe the women when they came and told him. And it says Peter ran to the tomb and saw it empty, and he was confused. So it actually had been going really well for Jesus up until his crucifixion. He had been amazing people. He had performed miracles. In some ways, he was disrupting society, actually. And at one point, he had thousands of people following him around, and so he had been growing in significance. But he'd been rising so significantly out of his insignificance that the religious leaders and the Romans had become threatened by him. And in order to put an end to this rise in significance, they had him killed. So that's where we find Jesus leading up to Easter morning. We find him in a tomb. He's crucified. His life has ended, and he's seemingly done. I recently had the incredible opportunity to visit Rome in Italy with my wife. It was our 20th wedding anniversary, and so we took a trip there. And while we were there, we saw a lot of amazing things, but what ended up happening throughout our time there was I became overwhelmed with just how insignificant Jesus would have been in the context of the Roman Empire and the height of Roman power. And so I was led to, in my imagination, to be amazed at the Romans, at the height of their power, all of their armies, their victories, the territories that they took over. Their society was so advanced for the time. They had so much wealth and power that it was unbelievable. And even today, it's unbelievable. As I walk around in 2025, tens of millions of people flock to Rome to go and just to be amazed at the power of the Roman Empire back in that time and the buildings that still stand today. As we walked around looking at statues and buildings, it was actually really overwhelming. We became so overwhelmed by all the history and just how much there was that we almost became desensitized to it all. One day we decided we'd just go look, we just wanted to go walk in a park and just see some greenery and some nature. And before we did that, we went and we sat down and had a sandwich for lunch right before we went into this park. And as we're sitting there on the steps of a church eating our sandwiches, we looked in the center. We kind of noticed the center of this square we were sitting in had a large, it was over 200 feet tall, a big stone pillar. I later found out it was made of red granite, had etchings and carvings in it. We just kind of wondered, what is this random big stone thing? It turns out it's 3,500 years old. It's from the time of Ramses II. The Romans had so much power and might and strength in their armies as they took over Egyptian territories. They took this obelisk from Egypt and they collected it. It was one, I don't remember how many obelisks. There's dozens of obelisks all over Rome. They just gathered from around the world. So this is the height of power that the Romans had. It's just clear, even more than 2,000 years later, Israel stood no chance against the powers of Rome. And under their rule, the Jewish people were insignificant. Again, on top of that, Jesus didn't carry significance even among his own people. You may recognize this building. It's the Colosseum. The Colosseum is one of the greatest symbols, or remaining symbols, of Roman power and culture. There's a lot of amazing things about the Colosseum. The fact that they built this in only 8 years. You can just imagine, how can you build this in 8 years? Well, it's because they had tens of thousands of slaves. It turns out the majority of those tens of thousands of slaves were Jewish slaves. But there's just, we probably know it for the gladiator death matches. There was animal slaughter there. There was a whole lot of horrible things that happened at the Colosseum. And the Romans celebrated it, and they gathered there. It was one of their favorite places to be. It held 80,000 people. And one of the most amazing things to me is the fact that this building lasted over 500 years. We're replacing our Saddle Dome here in Calgary. I wonder if we just left it, would that still be standing in 100 years even? But it was used for 500 years. 80,000 people gathered there for over 500 years. You can't tell when you look at it now. It used to be covered in white marble. And so, a symbol of Roman power and might. And as amazing as all the history of the Colosseum is, there was something that actually I just became fixated on when I went to the Colosseum to visit it that morning. In the place that became the symbol of Roman power, the same Roman power that ruled over God's people in Jesus' day. And keep in mind, this is the same Roman power that crucified Jesus. It's the power that nailed him to the cross. This is the gate that we entered through. I don't know if you can see the cross that's now fixed above the gate at the Colosseum. And if that weren't enough, as we went in and we were standing in the arena, in the center of the Colosseum, directly in front of where the emperor's box once was. Remember the place where the emperor would put his thumb up or down? He had the power of whether someone would live or die. This is the picture, what we saw. If you can see the cross there. It's right in front of where the emperor's box once was. So in the same place where the emperor once sat, where tens of thousands of Romans would look in submission to the one who had the entirety of the power of Rome in his hands, now sits a cross. This was put here about 350 years ago. It hasn't been there forever. But the juxtaposition of these crosses located in these spots within this building was just astounding to me. This building representing the power of Rome that hung Jesus on the cross, now crumbling to pieces, barely holding on to a glimpse of the glory that it once had. And then in the center, the cross of Jesus, representing the powerful, enduring kingdom of God that continues to stand firm and reign with power and authority and might over all of creation. If we fast forward a few hundred years after the death of Jesus, we find the emperor of Rome himself, Constantine, on his knees, surrendering to Jesus, making Christianity the religion of Rome. It's just astounding that the same Jesus who was crucified and killed by the Roman Empire ended up bringing the entire Roman Empire to its knees. And the thought that came to mind while I was in the Colosseum was, how could this have happened? And the only answer is Jesus rose. And I actually kind of wanted to shout this out. I was looking around at the people who were just looking at the building and how amazing this building is, and I wanted to say, guys, how could this have happened? Jesus rose. Jesus is the one with the power. Remember where we find Jesus leading up to Easter morning. That's why we celebrate Good Friday. We find him in a tomb. He's crucified, and his life is ended and seemingly done. So within this context, I want to read through the Easter story with you this morning. We'll read from Luke chapter 24, starting in verse 1. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were there wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen." So the ladies then ran back and they told the disciples, but the disciples didn't believe them. Later in verse 13, we read, Now that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. And as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. As we continue reading the story, Jesus goes with them and walks with them to this village. It says he eats with them, and then he went away. And after he went away, they immediately ran back to tell the disciples that they'd seen Jesus. And in verse 36, as they're still talking about this with the disciples, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and feet. It's I, myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe it, because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. He said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. He told them, "This is what is written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem." He says, "You are witnesses of these things." So if I were to keep reading this morning, I could go on for a long time reading the different eyewitness accounts of Jesus' resurrection. We could go through the entire rest of the New Testament, reading the stories and impact of a risen Christ. We read about people and hear from people that didn't just flippantly or casually claim Jesus rose. We read about and hear from people that faced persecution and death because of their claims of what they witnessed. And once they witnessed it, there was nothing that could stop them from getting the word out. And word spread. A movement began with thousands turning to faith in Jesus within days. Faith and surrender to the same Jesus that was killed on a cross just weeks earlier. Thousands of people turning to Jesus within weeks, the same Jesus that was killed and put into a tomb. We can now look back throughout history of a sweeping and unstoppable movement of God that changed the course of history and has impacted every era of human history since it happened. There's a poem that was written about 100 years ago. It's very popular, written by James Allan Francis. I want to share this with you this morning, the way that he puts this. He was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in still another village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. Then for 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family or owned a house. He did not go to college. He never visited a big city. He never traveled 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of the things one usually associates with greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves, and while he was dying, his executioners gambled for his clothing, the only property he had on earth. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 19 centuries, 20 now, have come and gone, and today he remains the central figure of the human race and the leader of mankind's progress. All the armies that ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all parliaments that ever sat, all the kings that ever reigned put together have not affected the life of man on this planet so much as that one solitary life. And so Jesus, a seemingly insignificant man in the eyes of most people for most of his life on earth, became the most significant man in all of history because he rose. And here's the point I'm trying to make by all of this morning. First, I want you to just absorb this truth into your heart, to soak this in. But next, I want you to consider this. What are the implications of the resurrection on your life? What does this mean? I'll put it this way. If I were to say, because Jesus rose, blank, how would you fill in that blank? Because Jesus rose, There's lots of options. I could give you a lot of options this morning. Because Jesus rose, we have hope. Because he rose, we have freedom. Because he rose, we are citizens of his kingdom. We have purpose, we have power, we have life, we have eternity. The list could go on and on. The resurrection changes everything, and it did change everything. For the past 2,000 years, everything has been impacted by it. Whether people want to admit it, whether people understand or believe it or know it or not, it has impacted human history like nothing else. And when you add up all the many things we now have as a result of the resurrection, I think there's one thing that I hope we don't miss, and I want to make sure that we don't miss. It's something that I often forget. And it's this: because Jesus rose, you are significant. Because Jesus rose, you are significant. And I don't mean you're significant like the CEO of a Fortune 500 company is significant, or the President of the United States is significant, or any sort of person you would look at it within your world or your realm that you would think this person is a significant person. You're not significant in that way. You are more significant than the most significant person on earth based on our perspectives here. You are not just significant, but eternally significant because Jesus rose. This might seem a little oversimplified or basic, but answer this for me. Is this how you think of yourself? How much is this understanding and belief that you are significant, not just significant, but you are eternally significant, how much does that shape your life? When you wake up in the morning, are you fired up and filled with joy and excitement knowing who you really are and whose you really are? When you're faced with challenging circumstances in life, do you face those challenges with confidence, knowing your identity is shaped by the resurrection of Jesus and the power of the Savior of the world who is risen? Because Jesus rose, you are not who others think you are. You are not who you often think you are. Your life is not limited to your failures or your weaknesses. And your life's not defined by your losses and hurt. I'll repeat that one. Your life is not defined by your losses or your hurt because Jesus rose. And as I was thinking of this morning and all of this, my mind and my heart was brought to a prayer in Ephesians chapter 1. It's a prayer that Paul shared with the Ephesian church, and I want to share this with you this morning. He said, I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened, in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in his holy people, and his incomparably great power for us who believe. That power is the same as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Christ from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly realms, far above all rule and authority, power and dominion, and every name that is invoked, not only in the present age, but also in the one to come. And God placed all things under his feet and appointed him to be head over everything for the church, which is his body, the fullness of him who fills everything in every way. And so Paul writes that not only has Christ risen to ultimate power and significance in the world, but we also carry that significance in us. The battle that I've fought and struggle with still today, with feeling insignificant, it's a result of a focus on myself. I focus on all of my weaknesses, all of my faults, and who I am in the eyes of others. But for those who trust in a resurrected Jesus, our lens is different. I can see some of you wear glasses like I do. And so for you, if you were to take your glasses off, you would look at the world a little differently, wouldn't you? I wouldn't be able to recognize most of you right now. I had an experience a few years ago on a backpacking trip in the wilderness where we were hiking a lot, and so I was sweating a lot, and my glasses slipped off of my face, fell to the ground in the rocks, and were stepped on. and we're broken. And so here I am in the middle of the wilderness with no glasses. And so for days, the remaining days that I was there, I wasn't able to wear glasses. And, I can't tell you how frustrating that was to be in somewhere in God's creation, in nature, standing on mountaintops, looking out at a blurry landscape, being unable to see things clearly. It was so frustrating. And I'll never forget the amazing feeling when I got back to my truck. I had an extra pair of glasses, thankfully, because I need them to drive. And I was able to put my glasses back on and see clearly again. For those of us who trust in Jesus, we need to remember that we see the world through the lens of the cross and the resurrection. And this makes everything much more clear for us. This changes our perspective. We look at life and the world differently. It's easy to wake up each day and to look at our life through the lens of our weaknesses, our struggles, and our hurts. It's easy to see ourselves the way others see us. And for some of us, that means we don't think too highly of ourselves. For others, it maybe means we have a false sense of thinking too highly of ourselves. I haven't talking about that very much this morning. That's a different sermon. But this leads us to a blurry vision of our life and who we are. It has a significant impact on how we live. Our actions, our drive, our ambitions, our goals, they're all impacted by how we view ourselves through this blurry lens. But if we put on resurrection glasses, we can see things more clearly. Another way of putting this would be, if you've ever read a book, I hope you've read a book before, but if you open up a book and you read a book, as you're reading it, there's a header in that book, and it'll tell you what chapter you're on. And so it's kind of a reminder of where you are in that book, everywhere you're reading. If you wrote a paper at school, usually you'd put a header. Maybe the page number's up there. You have the title of your paper on there, so you're always remembering what this paper is. We all have a header that we need to have on the pages of our life. If we were to write out our life as a story, we would have a header on there that says, Jesus hung on the cross and Jesus rose. And we would always remember, every page of our story would have that header on it. Don't ever forget, as a follower of Jesus Christ, that you carry with you hope, that you carry with you the riches of his glorious inheritance, that every day you carry with you an incomparably great power, the same power that rose Jesus from the dead. Our hope is not, and our hope and what drives us in life is not found in, the things that we're pursuing here on earth, whether it's a career or a relationship. That's not what drives us. Our hope is found in eternity and union and communion with God and living with him eternally. Our riches are not found in what we have in our bank account or in the size of the home that we live in. Our riches are found in the inheritance that we've received through Christ, through his death, through his resurrection. We are a member of his body. We are citizens of his kingdom. And we carry with us the same power that raised Christ from the dead. Let that soak into your hearts. What's possible through faith? What's possible through you and in you if you trust in this and if you live with this kind of confidence and courage? I want to revisit here the statement I asked earlier, because Jesus rose. What action item could or should you add to that blank? Think of an action item this week. Do not allow the lie that you are insignificant to dictate how you fill in the blank in your life. There is no limit to what God can do through you, and especially through us, his body, the church. What if we were to absorb that truth into our hearts? How would we live? My encouragement to you this morning is to go from here and to live that way.